I'd like to call this meeting of the Board Governance Committee to order. Ms. Kubish, would you please take the roll?
For the Director of Finance, Irena Ortega. Dana Dillon. Here. Paul Rosensteel. Here. For the State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Michelle Zumot. Here. Mr. McGuire, you have a quorum.
Thank you. First item is approval of committee agenda work plan. Have a motion?
Move approval.
Second.
Motion's been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any nays? No. Motion passes. Item 2, approval of minutes of the June 6, 2013 Board Governance Committee meeting, open session. Is this an action item?
Move approval.
Thank you.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any nays?
Arena's abstaining.
Request, I'm sorry.
No, she's just abstaining.
Ms. Ortega,
Yes, I just wanted to abstain from the minutes. Thank you. There wasn't anyone from finance here.
thank you. Motion passes. Let's see, bring this up again. Item 3 is adoption of the gift policy, the fourth reading. Brian, is that a record? I'm going to turn it over to you, but I'm curious.
I believe it is, yes.
All right, thank you, Brian.
So, thank you. So we are, this is an action item. I'd like your indulgence for a few minutes to put this in context. I know we last discussed this back in June, at our June meeting, but I'd like both for the benefit of the committee, for the staff, and for members of the public and our members of our system to sort of go through briefly, you know, where are we now and how did we get here? But I want to take that in reverse order, if you don't mind, and sort of how did we get here and then where are we? A few years ago, there were a couple of major scandals involving pension plans. There was a perception of continued pay-to-play through gifts or you know, sort of benefits conferred on folks within pension plans for making certain decisions. So there was across the country there were some approaches. There was the remedial approach for those that had experienced scandals and difficulties, and then there was the prophylactic approach for those systems or public pension plans like CalSTRS that had not experienced a problem, but it was a desire was expressed to avoid those problems by imposing a stricter gift policy. In the context of California, Controller Chung introduced legislation and sort of carried forth the banner on a specific gift limitation of $50. That seems simple, and I know that CalPERS adopted something like that, and it might seem simple, especially to the public. And why is it so difficult to just adopt a simple, you can't take more than $50 as a gift from someone doing business? But the problem, what makes it difficult is it falls within a complex series of laws and regulations that define gifts. And so it is not simply a quid pro quo. It's not simply can somebody give you a gift certificate for $100? It has more. It involves travel. It involves certain types of transportation. It involves meals, and that's why you've struggled with this. You know, over 4 different meetings, and I think that's important to put in context because there really has been an attempt by the committee to address some of the unintended consequences or potential challenges. I think that the controller and other members of the committee still lead this from the tone on the top, still want to have a straightforward and transparent gift policy, but are trying very hard to avoid unintended consequences and interfere with business relationships or business activities. And so sort of the history, staff came before you and we presented and discussed, there was vigorous discussion on various options. We provided some metrics on the actual effect of the policy. In other words, what were the gifts that were actually being received? There's some hyperlinks to those prior presentations in your board materials. We basically presented metrics that said, we don't have a problem. As far as we know, we haven't experienced any difficulty. There are instances where this gift policy would affect some of the business practices of our investment folks, but the scope of that was a limited scope. How you wanted to interpret those figures, would be up to the reader, but it was the information we presented was that there wasn't a problem, but there was a potential interference, but it wasn't as widespread as perhaps we were afraid. And you've heard differing points of view. I think you might hear some of those again today. And then, of course, we provide information of what your peers are doing and what they have done, and they're all across the board. Again, I just want to emphasize for everyone's benefit that there's no actual problem. We haven't identified any actual abuse at CalSTRS. It is merely the committee has been trying to carefully navigate all the possible ramifications. So let me get to where are we? Well, at the last meeting, again, after vigorous discussion, there was direction from the committee for staff to come back with a policy that would apply across the organization, would impose the FPPC gift limit across the organization, in other words, not just to the Form 700 filers, which I think are about 300 in the organization. So this would involve all 965 employees, and it would have a nexus requirement. In other words, the gift is a gift that's received from someone that's doing business or potentially doing business with CalSTRS, as opposed to, the FPPC rules are a little bit broader than that. But there was considerable interest expressed and considerable discussion, which I don't think was really resolved, on also having a policy with similar limits to CalPERS. And so we took a look at that. Jill took a look at the language, and you'll see there's some minor differentiation from the CalPERS policy, we think, for clarity, especially on the definition of gifts. So we put together those two policies. We provided links to the history, and now we have before you the two alternatives: the across the board FPPC 440 limitation with the nexus requirement, and we have the CalPERS like $50 gift limitation. So I'm happy to answer any questions or anything else that information we can provide.
Okay. I don't see any requests to speak from members of the committee. Mr. Rosensteel. Now I do. Paul?
Yeah, so I'm just, in my mind, again, trying to clarify the differences. So the first idea is it's just the FPPC rules, except for anybody who's currently a Form 700 filer, the rules wouldn't change. They would still be living with the Form 700 rules and report what they would currently have to and couldn't accept a gift beyond what the FPPC rules require. The basic change is that for people in the organization who are not Form 700 filers, it would impose restrictions, but it would be narrower than Form 700 because there would have to be this nexus. And that's essentially what that first. Okay, so then the second one, though, does put a dollar limit of $50 on what can be accepted by again, anybody in the organization, Form 700 filers and anybody else, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And so it's a more restrictive rule. There again has to be, though, some nexus. It's not, doesn't apply to just anything, right?
Yes.
Correct.
Okay.
But you're right, it is a more restrictive rule than the current rules that apply.
And more restrictive than the Form 700.
Than Form
Than
700.
Right, than FPPC. Okay. And that's parallels what the CalPERS rule is.
Yes.
Okay. And Brian, you've said that this is not being raised because we've identified a problem that needs to be addressed. It's just a desire to clarify the rules.
Yes, that's correct. As far as CalSTRS, we have not identified a problem. Problem hasn't been reported to us. As I said, this was presented and originally discussed as a forward-looking measure to prevent potential abuses. But there were no actual abuses identified, and still to this date, we have not uncovered any specific problem.
Brian, could you speak up,
I'm so
please?
sorry. It is a forward-looking policy. It is not addressing any actual problem. As far as we're aware, we have not had an instance where, there was a problem with the gift policy. And that would be reflected in some of the metrics that we provided you, which pretty much showed that this was really involving travel, it's mostly in the investment area, travel, due diligence, those kind of meals, those kind of things, not anything more than that, not a quid pro quo or anything like that.
Thank you.
Paul, you finished?
I'm finished with my questions, yes, thank you.
Ms. Ortega?
Yeah, we would support option 2, the second option, and I think both because I think we feel more comfortable with the more restrictive option, and then also that we have not heard of any problems that it's caused with the CalPERS staff to have the more restrictive limit. So I would make a motion to adopt the second option for the gift policy.
Is there a second to that motion?
Second. For purposes of discussion.
All right. There's a motion by Ms. Ortega to essentially, I believe, adopt option B. And it was seconded by Ms. Dillon for discussion purposes. Mr. Boykin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Treasurer Lockyer is not on this committee, but I just wanted to say was very much involved in the drafting and the deliberations of the CalPERS gift policy, and has consistently supported adopting something similar here. So were I on the committee, I would be supporting the motion.
Ms. Dillon?
So, through the chair, to Chris, I guess. Is everyone in the investment shop Form 700 filers?
For the record, Chris Alman, Chief Investment Officer. All the investment officers, not the support staff, but investment officers and up. So IO1 and up fill out a Form 700.
Would there be, I don't know quite how to put this, investment officers within certain asset classes that this could possibly affect more than others?
Yes.
So are there some that do more travel and could be impacted by having meetings that involve meals and stuff with investment partners that we have?
And yes, and I want to expand that. It's not just travel for due diligence. It includes like conference participation. So even our operations staff that attends audit functions, things like that, would be impacted.
Mr. Rosensteel?
Well, first of all, I want to hear what Chris has to say, and then I'll ask him a question.
So I was raising my hand to get in line.
I'm sorry.
Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. I just want to say, if you're inclined to do the CalPERS policy, I know we've had 5 readings, but we want to set a record. I would actually encourage you to consider putting it off. We have spoken to the CalPERS compliance staff. They are finding challenges with implementing their rule, and they're currently considering, at least at that level, revising their regulation. As you can see on INV 17, there are exceptions to the rule, and they're finding it very complex on how to interpret those. We talked to the staff, so obviously the staff is going to tell us their unspoken view, which is that it's been very difficult and somewhat demoralizing to figure out this relative to the travel. For instance, in the middle, under the exceptions, it includes a trade association, but as you know, Dana just recently attended the AIM conference, which is an Asian American Investment Management Association. We would need to find out their tax status, about whether they're a 501c3 or whether they're a trade association. It just adds a level of complexity to our staff to be able to figure out what they can go to or can't go to. And the comments we've gotten back from PERS, and they have not been made public, is that they find it very challenging at the investment staff level. Not surprised I've been an advocate for Policy 1. And one thing that not all of you are aware, we do quarterly tracking of all gratuity in the investment office. It's electronic. The staff is required to complete it. It allows us to manage behavior and work with especially new staff that aren't used to state rules versus the other policy that's more of an absolute. They actually wouldn't record anything because it's at the $50 level, which is below the FPPC or at the FPPC threshold. So I would be worried that we've seen incidents in other funds where it's driven behavior underground and they just avoid things. I think right now we're very much transparent. We can manage it. We can work with and work with the staff on the behavior and anything that's going on. I think that's why we haven't ever had an issue here. I know, as Brian said, we haven't found one. I can say we have not had one because we're very much into the transparency. So I know there's a desire to have a tougher standard. I would just encourage you to wait to see what PERS is now going to do as they work through theirs before we move to that. I'm fully supportive of having all of STRS have a gift policy and follow some system. It's worked very well in the investment office. And we've had that in place since about 2003, so.
Paul?
Thank you. So you say that first of all of the investment officers and above in investments are Form 700 filers, but that you also track on a quarterly basis gifts. So, and then those gifts have to be reported if they're $50 or more on Form 700. So, is it your opinion, as are you in agreement with Brian, that we haven't identified a problem and we haven't seen, you know, what looks like excessive or extraneous to actual business, you know, substantial gifts like, you know, $300 Christmas presents or, you know, golf at Pebble Beach or something like that? Or is it mostly in connection with business events where there's a meal or there's, you know, some kind of an event, but somebody is attending that for a specific business purpose as opposed to just being marketed to?
And I would take it farther than, I totally support what Brian said. He and Jill have not found anything in the history, and that dates back before Jill. I'll take it a step farther because I'm seeing the activity to say we have not had a problem. Because in that quarterly reporting, I get a report from my compliance staff that tells me what somebody did in a quarter. So I can modify behavior during the year. And Paul, you know, I know the history way back to the 2000. Back then, it wasn't uncommon for some people to play golf, or they would offer, they would take somebody to a show in New York, or they would take them to a spa for facial. As we started to institute these in 2003, those behaviors just very much evaporated. And then in the old days, we'd get big tins of popcorn at Christmas and gift baskets. We started writing letters. I call them the maple syrup, yeah. That, everybody loves these goofy little maple syrup things. But I started writing, we call it the Grinch letter, that goes out at the beginning of Christmas and now reminds everybody, we do not accept gifts. We do not want gifts coming. And it took about a couple of years, but I would say by 2007, it wiped it all out. Then after 2008, we just saw managers cut back on that. So we have been removed from all those lists. It is not a problem. And even when we hire new staff from the outside who are not used to our rules, it's very easy to monitor them in terms of things like, a good example we've had where coaching came in some of the bankruptcies in real estate, there were continual meetings after meetings where there were lunches provided because it was working through meetings. So I could catch that staff early to say, hey, you need to start paying for these so that you don't climb up to $200, $300. And that's why I like the transparency, because we can work with the staff and educate and coach them versus it being kind of unwritten and unseen. I'm worried that if it's unseen and unheard, that doesn't mean it's not happening.
Well, there's still the requirement to report it. I mean,
Yeah.
in one, if we go the CalPERS route, we're saying no gifts above $50. If we go with the first route, we're saying, yeah, you can take the gift, but under FPPC rules, it has to be reported.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think that professional staff are influenced by taking the occasional lunch at a business meeting or a conference, that they are attending not for fun, but they're attending because it's part of their job. That they're going to compromise the integrity of the decisions that this organization makes. If it was Broadway tickets, if it was baseball games, if it was golf, if it was $300 Christmas presents, that would be a different thing. But it sounds like we don't have that. And I guess the other question that I would have though for you though is, do we not have that because of written policies, or is that just kind of the culture of the place that everybody understands that you're looking at those quarterly reports and people are going to, get called into your office if there's a lot of stuff?
Yeah,
like
I guess I would say, while we probably haven't had a written gift policy, maybe there's been the feeling that there is one, because we instituted, in the year 2000, we instituted a rule of transparency, and when I got here, I immediately applied the rule, Form 700 to all investment staff. Before it was just the official filers. And then we started the gratuity tracking in about 2003. And I think it's now ingrained, so it's not even an unusual thing. Everybody is used to it, and that. So I guess to answer your question succinctly, it's a combination of, it's good to have policy, and I know Nancy Williams has advocated you need a policy that applies to the board. I think we've tried to address it very aggressively in the investment office, so it's just part of the culture. The policy will help, but that's why I advocate for policy 1 on 15, because that would just formalize what we have and apply it to the rest of the building.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think my perspective is I don't see a compelling reason why we need to go to number 2, and especially if you're telling us that there's some feedback from CalPERS about problems, which I wouldn't surprise me. I don't see it seems to me that 1 is a sufficient safeguard, perhaps with a little bit of further definition about what's an appropriate and an inappropriate gift to accept.
Paul, you finished?
Yes.
Dana?
Through the chair to Chris, I think, Chris, that you bring up, when you talked about the AIM luncheon, it would only take one more, the cost of that luncheon probably was enough that it would only take one more thing to go over the $50 limit. And I'd really hate to pass something that was restrictive only to have CalPERS revisit it and then them go above it, and then we'd have to revisit it. I can't imagine that they would go beyond what we already have as the option 1. So I'd like to move a substitute motion to approve option 1. I'll just leave it at that.
There's a substitute motion. Is there a
I'll
second?
second that.
Substitute motion by Ms. Dillon, seconded by Mr. Rosensteel. Any discussion of this? All right, I see no discussion. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Nay. Any abstentions? All right, substitute motion passed. All right. Gee,
And we saved you from a 5th, Brian.
Brian, we avoided a 5th reading.
Thank you. If I could, I'd give you all a $50 gift.
No, thank you.
Okay. Let's move on to item 4, review proposed revisions to the board policy manual. Mr. Bartow?
Again, if you, with your indulgence, I'd like to put this in context. I think that when we presented it as a proposed addition to the work plan, we added a little context to it. So I just want to very briefly point out that this board and staff worked very hard to create, in 2005, 2006, to create a board policy manual that really set the standard for other pension plans across the nation. And still, very often, the provisions that are in your board policy manual are cited or reviewed by other people and appear in other publications or other analysis of what should be in a board policy manual. But most of the yeoman work was done in 2006, and so it's now 7 years later. And as we presented, we think maybe it's time to look at some of the provisions. And in our discussions, or in the committee's discussions regarding the ethics policy and the gift policy and other policies, it was noted that there are some inconsistencies in the policy or some lack of clarity, especially as policies apply to staff or to board members. In addition, we've had at separate times, we've had input from your fiduciary council and from your board governance consultant as to providing additional information in there regarding your fiduciary duty or other clarifications, and perhaps not just leaving you with the statutes that you can get out of law book. You don't need in a board policy manual. So we, with your approval, with your direction, we put this on the work plan. We're starting off slowly with some suggestions as to where we should go. Although it's not in the write-up item, I also would like to suggest that it be a regular item in your work plan. You meet generally 3 times a year, and part of your work plan would be to look at possible changes, sort of a blanket look at the policy manual for updates. So there are some specific suggestions. I don't know what your preference is. Jill can walk through each of them for you, or we're happy to answer questions, whatever your preference is.
Are there any comments or questions? The committee? All right, Brian, I see none. Thank you very much. Oh,
Dana had something.
Dana, I'm sorry. There you are.
So Brian, just taking a look at how you're proposing to arrange these, we have the board member responsibilities, and then we delineate what the board members' responsibilities are. And then we go to notice of meetings, administration of meetings, closed session policy, agendas, minutes. It seems to me that the notice, the closed session policy, and the agendas and the minutes all have to do with the administration of the meetings, although that section is a little bit more has more delineation as to the administration of those meetings. Would it make sense to, if we're going to group the board member responsibilities, to group notice of meetings, administration of meetings, closed session agendas and minutes in something that has a larger heading, and then use those as subtitles also?
Yes, that's an excellent suggestion.
Okay.
I just hadn't thought of it, but yes, that's an excellent
So that,
suggestion.
so we have board member responsibilities, and we have something about meetings, and then everything about
And
the
then the
meeting that's under.
subcategories of meeting.
Because then that would, we do that with charter, so it kind of follows that pattern. Thank you. I think that's it for me.
We will incorporate that when we bring it back.
Oh, no, I have one more, I'm sorry. Are you okay, Tara? On the 600, we have the statement of ethical conduct, the insider trading, conflicts of interest, political duties, and then we have the statement of fiduciary duties. It seems to me that I guess I look at my fiduciary duty as being primary and then the ethical conduct secondary. I mean, they're all interrelated, but we talk often about our fiduciary responsibility and the obligation we have as fiduciaries. It seems like that ought to come first. So that's another suggestion that I have.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think we can rearrange those. We were working within the construct of the 600H and J and trying to keep those in place
Right.
because of the procedures that go along with that, but I think we can switch those two
Okay.
sections, and that would be fine.
And that's-
And then on this also, we talked about changing third party to placement agents. So on K, we have disclosure of third party relationships. We need to change that third party relationships to placement agents in the
Yes.
table of contents. Alrighty, that does it for me. Really, this time, honest, Terry.
Okay. Any further comments by any other committee members? All right. Thank you.
Feedback.
We'll move on to item 5, review of information requests. Ms. Lukens, do you recall any? I don't. No. Think that they're wording. Okay. Item 6, draft agenda for the next committee meeting. Any comments? This is opportunity for public comment. Is there any member of the public who would like to speak? Seeing none, this meeting is adjourned.